Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session of our Project on Civil Discourse summer series. I see that people are coming in from the waiting room. I'm really excited about today. A little note on just process. If you look at the chat function in on Zoom, you can see a link to the closed captioning. And then if you do choose to share the video later, this is being recorded, it will be fully finished and captioned and posted on our site. So the way that we do these discussions is that we like to have them be somewhat interactive. So we'll spend the first half hour to 35 minutes in conversation with some questions that I have for our wonderful guests. And then we'll also move to questions from you, the participants. You're welcome to ask the questions in the chat function or to ask to be unmuted and ask a question live. That's really up to you, as is whether you turn on your camera. Everybody should feel that this space is comfortable and right for them and what they want to experience today. I'm really excited about today's event, and I'll introduce our two distinguished guests. We decided to do a series on communication and community across distance. And one thing that occurs to me is that oftentimes when we talk about this extraordinary time of social distancing and convening virtually, there's a habit of using a sort of a deficit model to describe it. In other words, that how are we coping with doing things differently? How are we coping with doing things more online? And one thing that I think is really special to point out is that there are ways in which online spaces can be great, whether it be for exploring spirituality, exploring community, and they can in fact be spaces that are more accessible. Inaccessibility or deficiency, aren't necessarily online things. So I do hope we can have a rich discussion, not only of the challenges, but the opportunities of connecting and building faith remotely. So our two guests are Rabbi Ruti Regan and Reverend Khristi Adams, and each of them is going to just share their thoughts for a couple of minutes before we get into questions. So Reverend Adams, would you like to open us up?
Before I start, the captions don't seem to be working. So can we fix the captions just to make sure it's accessible?
Yes, for sure. I'm just going to pause for a moment while I ask this question. I've just typed into the chat, thanks everyone for holding on. I'm just going to pause for a moment. Everyone for holding on. Sorry, I'm typing first. While we wait, why don't we introduce ourselves in the chat? Just an accessibility note for everyone. The captioners are actually getting set up. Testing the captioning now.
Still not working for me.
Nor for me.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. First off, I'd like to apologize for the fact that the captioning is not working. We're trying to get another captioner set up and working on this. The company has said it would be like a 1 or 2 minute delay, and that time has passed. I'm very apologetic. We've never had this issue before. We've been using the same company for a very long time, many years, and never have run into this before. I believe that our communications director is trying to join the meeting, and I'm sure he'll add to what I'm saying. I'm monitoring it, trying to see if the captioning is getting up and going, but I'd just like to really apologize. We always have accessible events, so this is rather shocking for us, and it's a little embarrassing for the school. As I said, I'm really sorry. I think the problem will be resolved, but
we're working on it right now. We use an outside vendor for our captioning services, and there seems to be some mix-up where they had a captioner that was supposed to be assigned to this and then did not. The captioner's not available or did not actually caption it, so we're trying to get a backup captioner right now. We always caption our events, as Lara, as you know, we've always had captions for these events, and so this is not something that's really ever happened for us. And so we're working right now really quickly to get a captioner in place.
Okay. So I apologize, everyone. So it's inadequate, like attempting to caption myself is not an adequate way to do things. So I will type a message in the, so do we have a sense of how long it will be? Because I think for our guests, both our speakers and the people who signed on, we should make a decision about whether we're actually going to do this or not.
I know that they are actively, give me 1 second, I just got an email. Okay, so yes, someone is coming on immediately. So apologies again, I apologize for the delay in this, but we do have a captioner who is about to start. And the link will be the same.
So for our two panelists who have started saying amazing, interesting insights in the chat, respectfulness of your time, might we go over some, or do you still need to stop at one?
Okay, she is signing in as we speak to start captioning.
Has the caption started working?
It looks like it's online, but I'm not seeing any actual captions yet.
I don't think we've started talking yet, so okay. We should be able to start talking and she'll be captioning.
So let's move.
The captioner just said in the chat, I'm almost there, just getting set up.
Got it. So when we get started, why don't we start with Reverend Adams's kind of talk about you and move to I'll move into the questions, and what we'll do is it'll be a hard stop for you, Reverend Adams, and those who want to stay longer than one, we'll keep with the questions. And thank you, everyone. Has it started working?
Yes, it's working.
Wonderful. And I just want to say, community is frustrating and community is always worth it. So Reverend Adams, can you, I want to like move into our questions, and sort of, you've written stories of voices of girls of color in particular are often silenced, overlooked in this time of global pandemic when many people are isolated, when we try and have meetings and sometimes it's harder, it's possible to feel invisible. There are digital divides, media outlets are controlled largely by certain dominant voices, and other inequalities are magnified. But it seems that more people are also becoming willing to listen. And I'm wondering what you can say about both lifting voices and listening to voices in this time, particularly as you've written of like girls of color.
Yeah, it's been difficult. I'll say. I mean, I think it's been a big learning curve for a lot of us the last few months, in trying to really sift through all the voices. I think that's been a big thing for me, be it online, be it on television, you know, because I'm lacking the in-person community, that type of conversation. We're relying very heavily to opinions online. I'm relying very heavily to, you know, my news sources and things like that coming from online. So that's been a big shift for me because, particularly as a teacher, a lot of my engagement is in the classroom with students. You know, as educators, we're having faculty meetings, we're having actual conversations. Those things have moved online and they've all sort of fused under this one umbrella. I'm saying, obviously, I see like good things that come from it, but I'm always going to be pretty critical because then it becomes, okay, well, which voice do we listen to? Which voice do we hear? You know? If, you know, a few years ago, the term fake news was put out so much, I don't hear that term as much anymore, but I think it's just as applicable today than it was back in 2016, 2017. What's fake, what's not, what's real, what's not. And it was just recently that the director of WHO had said, like, you know, what's really gonna kill a lot of us is the misinformation, you know, that's going around. So, you know, I do think that it is important to, you know, it's important resource that we have before us, of being able to have all of this access, right? We have access to celebrities, you know, like to people that, you know, we couldn't reach before and couldn't touch. Now they're just like in our living rooms every day, you know, and on our computers, and they're responding and things like that. But there are, you know, there are voices that are, I think, going on unheard and overlooked, and particularly the ones that aren't agreeing with the masses in one way or the other. You know, it's very difficult to stand out if you have a unique perspective or opinion about something, right? Everything is two-sided. And so I think that's sort of where I'll end on that note.
And Rabbi Regan, how about you? And particularly, I guess, disability voices.
It's a couple of things. One is that I found, just I've been for, again, the last several years, a lot of my work has been with educators and directors of Jewish supplemental educational programs, mostly, who really, really deeply care about improving the inclusivity of their schools for kids with disabilities, who have often been not welcome or not educated in mainstream settings. And I found that one of the persistently most difficult things about that is to get people to really understand on a deep level that disabled people have perspectives, and that disability affects perspective, and that's okay. Found that there's this really strong implicit bias, again, even among people who are really acting in good faith, really want to get it right, that they think of disability like in terms of needs and in terms of like this sort of technical stuff, but don't think so much in terms of perspectives and knowledge and expertise from disabled perspectives. For instance, I'll hear a lot of stuff about, well, you know, we need to make sure that he has his fidget toys and his large print and like whatever accommodations. And we also need to make sure that we're thinking about what the other kids think about disability and how they understand it. Well, okay, that's true, but like also, what does he think? What does she think? Like, what is their own perspective on their own experiences? And how is that being welcomed into the room, especially when we're having conversation-based modalities, which we often are because education is moving that way. Another thought like about being online is I think that, you know, as someone who teaches both online and in person, I found that the skill sets involved are very different, and that I've been taught a lot of things very explicitly about how to teach in person. And I've had to figure out a lot more on my own about like how to teach on Twitter, how to build social media presence in a way that's conducive to civil discourse and uplifting voices that aren't heard. I've learned that it's very possible, and in some ways there's things that are possible, uniquely possible in that kind of space, but it's really not self-evident or intuitive. And I think that educators need a lot more support than they're getting in figuring out how to make it work, and in figuring out how to make it work in a way that's equitable, in a way that's like respectful, in a way that's accessible. And educators deserve better is usually true, but that's like the specific way in which I think it's true right now.
And it seems like there's a tie-in as well when you describe that there might be a bias against really seeing disability as including a perspective. I think an observation that a lot of people, I'm not as sure within the faith community, but for example, in higher education, there's an idea of like inclusivity or representation. Like I counted the faces in the room and the faces are different colors or the faces look different, so I did it. And a whole other group of people, of whom I'd say I'm one, that says, no, there's more. There's the personal experience, human experience, your actual voice contributing is a piece of it. Being in a room or a space is a start, but it's not it all. And I'm wondering, again, with Reverend Adams, with your idea of, you know, lifting voices, and you've said that that's challenging. Like, what is it that a different perspective brings? What is, if we're listening for voices, I guess, what are we listening for, and how do we get the voices raised or make the space for the voices to be upraised?
Yeah, well, I have a tendency to like not dwell on the past, but say in the past we used to do this. We didn't do everything perfectly in the past, but I do remember a time where, learning about unique perspectives and how the idea was everybody is coming from a unique place, a unique experience, a different perspective. And then we can all learn something from one another. We bring that to the table. I don't sense that is something all the time. Sometimes, like the Me Too movement, what came out of that, I really appreciated the different stories, the hashtags. There was one that I wrote about in my book back in 2016 called Loud Black Girl. It's a hashtag Loud Black Girl, talking about, Black women in their experiences being labeled as loud, called loud, and everybody's able to share. So that's where I've seen the good come out, because then you're not looking for one side per se. You're literally listening and looking for, to hear about that individual's perspective, that individual's experience. But then on the flip side of that, there is if you're not on the side of this, then you're on the side of that. There's that other thing that happens where when you do insert a unique perspective, that's not the space for it. I find, and I'm talking about Twitter in particular, not on Facebook, so I don't really know. I mean, I think the comments on Facebook sort of show that too, that, with the hashtags, I've seen that there is a sort of sense of unique individual experience of solidarity. But then in other spaces, when you're talking about politics or something else, then it's like my way or highway, and there's not that room for it. So, but I do think that it's a thin line. It depends. Like, it depends on what experience are you sharing. Like today, I think Terry Crews had said something like, I don't want Black Lives Matter to turn into Black Lives Better, right? So they went after him on that, and it's a narrow-minded perspective that he is sharing. But I wonder, because I'm not on the side of that particular perspective, but I wonder what listening to him, or I wonder what him putting that out and us going after him, I don't know if that does more harm than good. That's what I'm always torn by, because I'm sort of with them, like, what are you talking about, Terry? Let's get him. But then on the other end, it leaves no room for, unless somebody is giving an opinion or something like that does harm to another group, or you know what I mean? Then yeah, of course, then I understand that. But I wonder what that does and what that teaches our young people about conversation and the importance of conversation, right? And listening to different perspectives.
Well, it seems like, I often talk about both sidesism, and it's now a term that people understand reasonably well. One shortcoming of that term is that it seems to imply that things often, might only have two sides, or only have to, they might have many. And also that there might only be two options. I'm with Terry Crews or against. Mm-hmm. Option 3 is, I'll handle this later. There are more pressing communication needs. My not engaging might be the right strategic choice. My asking a question might be the right moral choice. And so I think that is potentially a challenge of online engagement, where our choices infuse words into the space or not. Mm-hmm. And that might be a challenge that in a classroom, kind of sitting and having a pause together. Silence online is hard. It isn't a tool that we have. But I see Rabbi Regan kind of reacting, and mm-hmm. I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
And I think that's huge. This thing where people sometimes like swarm in to like punish, like, voices that are offensive or challenging, and it gets really complicated. And I think one level on which it's complicated is that people who have not had a lot of social power to impose social sanctions on people who do things that hurt them can very easily end up like massively overcorrecting in instances where they start to have power. Because if you've never like had the opportunity to develop a practice of like figuring out how to be responsible with your power because you haven't had that kind of power before, it's really hard. And I think that like starting from like, and it's also really hard not to like realize that this is a problem and then go back to like not asserting power, not asserting boundaries, not saying like, hey, that's messed up. And I was also thinking, and I found that for me, I found like as an educator and especially online, I think that getting really good at distinguishing what's being said in good faith and what is not, and what I'm capable of responding to in good faith and what I'm not, is really core. Because there's just so much bad faith that if you treat it as though it's good faith, it ends up doing a lot of harm. But there's also people who know things I don't and who I need to be open to learn from. And there's also people who are like wrong, but like I'm wrong about stuff too. And like there are ways to deal with students, people engaging with you in good faith, being wrong and annoying that don't involve being mean to them. And again, like this is a skill set, and I think that, you know, people whose voices have not been valued often need a lot more support than they're getting, and like learning ways to be powerful that don't involve just like going out and being mean, especially since no matter what you do, people are going to call you mean. People are going to call you angry. It's hard to get good feedback because you will like be judged by certain people pretty much the same way, no matter what you do, if you speak from a certain perspective. So I think like that's like a spiritual leadership and educational role, like helping people to find ways to navigate that, learn other tools, and learn how to like be very selective about who we do and don't engage with and under what circumstances.
Yeah. I want to jump in there because we're going through something at my school now, boarding school. You know, they just became co-ed in 1999. So, you know, they're behind on just about everything.
Oh, wow.
And so, you know, now as a result of the racial tensions, it sort of spilled over into the school. And then, you know, then everybody just starts getting on them. How come you didn't make a statement? You know, all that. And now there's this the Black students have formed the alumni have formed a Instagram page and all that. They're going after them. And so the school's starting to respond. They can't handle it as much because this is all very new to them. But I'm trying to guide the students, like you said, Rabbi, right? Like, that's why I cannot be the school's director of diversity. I never wanted to be. So they're going to start a new search. But my main job has always been as chaplain. And, you know, like you said, spiritually, I want to be able to be in a position to guide them on how, like when you were talking about learning ways of being powerful without being mean, how to really address their anger,
Right.
their frustration, but they don't really want to go, they don't want to get anywhere, right? Like they just want to be mad, right. which is understandable. This is a time to be that way. But you know, how to correct, but also to affirm them in that. And that's been like a real challenge for me.
Yeah.
I think we have enormous comfort with emotion in discourse. Like I've noted that oftentimes, you know, when I have a Google alert set for civil discourse, and a lot of just, you know, civil discourse isn't that loud, or civil discourse isn't very emotional or very angry. And that's not what I personally think it's all about. But there's this affirming of anger, and then there are these things that you mentioned, Rabbi Regan, like around I can be wrong too, which connects to this question of forgiveness. And there's a question in the comments, you know, are there spaces for forgiveness, particularly as people evolve in their views? And I'm always cautious about asking for forgiveness, because oftentimes if you're in a position of power and you're sort of calling upon others for forgiveness, you know, that can be, I think, abusing that power in a way. But I know, Rabbi Regan, you've written about forgiveness, and I know you're grappling now, Reverend Adams, it sounds like, with students who are angry and maybe hopefully will be moving forward. Is forgiveness possible in online communities? Is it is forgiveness something we can ever do, like before we ever meet, or or are we meeting when we're engaging online?
I think that conversations that start with the premise that forgiveness should be the goal tend to short circuit justice work that needs to be done. And I think that the question of forgiveness or a lack thereof is often like very secondary or tertiary to like what's actually at stake. Like I think that there's a lot of real pressure on people who are like survivors of abuse or violence, or facing like ongoing abuse or violence or systemic injustice, to make that go away by like having a forgiving attitude, either in practice or saying like theoretically, here's what the conditions for forgiveness would be. And that often manifests as people saying things like, well, they only have so much as much power as you give them, forgive for your own sake. But actually, for my own sake, I want justice. And I'm pretty comfortable with that. And I think there's a difference between justice and cruelty and revenge, because I don't really have it out for anyone, but I do want justice. And I want the basic moral clarity of being able to acknowledge that a wrong is being done and that it matters and that something very serious is happening that needs to change, without the subject being immediately changed to like, okay, so, but can we ever forgive people? Because I just think that's not really what's at stake in a lot of conversations that people try to guide in that direction.
I've always seen forgiveness as a process and something that may need to take place. I see a difference between grace and forgiveness, and I've taught about this a lot in the last few weeks. I don't know if online is the space for forgiveness, because forgiveness just seems to require more, and online is so instantaneous. And, you know, I think there's a space for grace online. I don't think that grace requires forgiveness. I think forgiveness requires grace. And by that, I mean that I can give someone a pass and say, you know what, I'm going to leave you alone, right? Or I'm going to let this slide. And still, and not necessarily forgive them, right? I don't think it's required for me to give them that pass, and I have done that. We've seen that happen online. I also see the tension of people online wanting grace for their mistakes, but not willing to give that same grace out. And so I haven't seen that give and take a lot online either. But I don't think forgiveness has to be very personal. And I just don't see it as the online world as a space that is conducive for that process, the seriousness of that process.
And I think that grace, when you say that, it evokes for me some of the language that we've seen, particularly now in the COVID era, around resilience and around strength. I think showing grace is something that one does from power, or when you have reserves, you know. Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested in this question of strength. You've written about you can be, you know, strong, independent, but also vulnerable and fragile. And it seems like a particularly important thing to be able to offer oneself or have for oneself. And I'm wondering, you know, if you can sort of elaborate on that.
Yeah. So my book obviously I mean, not obviously, but it has been in the context of just young Black girls. But when I'm thinking just generally, bringing everything back to my job, since that's the first thing I'm thinking about right now. So I've had some conversations with our headmaster, and I've been saying, you know, if you just got up and did a video just saying, listen, I don't get it right, you know, that I haven't gotten it right, and I've messed up, and you know, I hope to do better. I hope to be better. Just something where you spoke from the heart. I saw that recently with Mike Krzyzewski, the Duke University basketball coach. He just put out a video, and people were commenting on it because they were saying that it didn't seem scripted. He was just talking, right? But anyway, so my headmaster's response, he didn't have the emotional bandwidth for that, right? That's basically what he was saying. It's not a critique of him, he's just being honest. He can do things scripted and whatever it might be. But I was saying, it's not going to solve all the problems being that vulnerable, but people will be able to see a certain level of authenticity. And for those that are in places of privilege or whatever it might be, that are being heavily critiqued right now, and might feel attacked or whatever it might be, just be honest. You know, the issue is when you come out and you're, you know, have all these scripted points and you're just beating around the bush. Just be honest. I messed up. I always mess up. You know what I mean? I'm going to keep messing up, but I'm going to try really, really hard not to. And the fact that that is so difficult, not just for him, but for a lot of people, is so telling, because this space that we have is supposed to be a space online for people to just share, right? So that is where I am. Rabbi, I know you want to say something.
Just think that is so real, how much trouble people have with acknowledging that they can be wrong about stuff. And that's like where I feel like getting past the need to center forgiveness can be really helpful, because, you know, it doesn't need to be like, what do I need to do to like be forgivable and like be a good person again? It needs to be like, just how do I deal with reality in the moment in the best way that I can? And I found that when I'm teaching people about inclusive education, one of the anxieties I get from a lot of people is like, well, before we do this, we want to make sure we're doing it right. And the thing I tell them is, no, you've got to do it wrong, because we're all in this hole together that's been dug by, like, you know, a very long-term problem of excluding and not teaching people with disabilities and not valuing certain people. And we didn't do all the sin, but but we're the ones who have to stop digging and working on fixing it, which means that we don't know how to do it right. And the only way to get it right is through trial and error, which means we've got to do it wrong. And we've got to be able to own the fact that we're going to make mistakes. People are going to have feelings about it. We're going to have to be able to acknowledge that, and we're going to have to be able to like keep trying and keep like making it better, without the expectation that there's going to be this moment of like, we're right about everything and we don't have to be wrong anymore.
So true.
Just get real. It's like part of it.
It seems like being a work in progress is harder for people, maybe harder than before. I don't know if my instinct here is right, but I think the fact that we all can be pundits now, online spaces are spaces to declare an opinion, as opposed to, you know, people don't often tweet, I don't know, you know.
Right.
And I do that a lot, but
you kind of want to, you know, but just in my classes, we practice saying I don't know in front of each other on the first day, which is really hard, because anybody can be authoritative now, and you know, but what is your advice to people if they're creating spaces for people to really come in and really be included? What's the way to bring people and say, you know, I see that you being a work in progress, or you having, you know, this much information, this tiny bit of information compared to what you'll have next week is fine. But these online spaces are typically public spaces, so it's possible there'll be maybe recriminations or derision from others. Like, how do we, you know, we can say how we're going to receive other people's communications, but can we really hammer out a space in online or any, you know, that where the welcome or where the grace sort of keeps, that's protective of whether it's the trolls or any of the other phenomenon you were talking about earlier?
I'll respond to this and then I gotta jump off. I'm so sorry. Real quick, it would have to be Zoom password protected, you know. I mean, there have to be boundaries. You'd have to create that safe space. It's the critique that Facebook is having right now, right? It's the reason why advertisers are pulling. You have no boundaries whatsoever, you know. You just let people do whatever and say whatever they want, and that's not cool. And so a lot of these spaces aren't boundaried spaces, and even with my kids, I wouldn't even, you know, I'm always saying, I'm so glad I didn't grow up in the age of social media, because I just, like, I didn't understand, you know, I would have just said something and it would be following me 20 years later, you know. I think for me, just as a faith leader, or even as a teacher, it's these small enclosed, like I said, password protected spaces, or, you know, small private groups on Facebook, you know, that's to me the only way that we will, you know, have someone feel free to engage in a way. It just would have to be with these small communities. I just don't think you're going to be able to do that within the world wide web of Twitter, of Facebook, of Instagram. You're not protected. There are no boundaries. So it can be created. It just has to be, like the other day I had the girls from my school, the girls of color from the school, and we all just met in Zoom. And I was there for the first 10 minutes and then said, you know what? And I know there's things that you want to say to each other, so I'm going to step out. It was halfway an excuse not to be there the whole time, but also, you know, me really wanting to provide them that space that normally they come over to my house, but they don't have that now. So it's like, okay, I'm going to step away. If you need me, you know, just shoot me a text message, but it's your room, it's your space. So that's the only way that I've been able to think of that in the last few months. Maybe there will be something, you know, in the future as we move forward. Sorry, I got to jump off. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
So I'd like to welcome, thank you very much, Reverend Adams. I'd like to welcome the other participants. Rabbi Regan can actually stay a bit longer, but maybe we can do our, you know, 10, 15 minutes of questions from you with our guest and have that part of this interactive conversation. And I see people popping up on camera, so. Or if you feel more comfortable as well, I can see you I have the chat open, so if people would like to add questions in the chat, that is fine as well. I can't see if FPC Ramsey, are you asking to unmute? I just saw you pop up on your I mean, I definitely have other questions for Rabbi Regan as well. You've done a lot where I've just sort of borne witness, and it's stuff that I'm pretty ignorant of, like things like parshas and, you know, biblical study online. And those are in spaces like Twitter that, unlike what Reverend Adams was talking about for her students, those are just open spaces, World Wide Web spaces where there's no boundary in terms of who could weigh in and participate. And I'm wondering if you can describe a little bit about how you've both thought of that, but also what that experience has been like doing that kind of inquiry and engagement and communication just in a space that really anybody can pop into.
I guess a couple of things. One is sort of the context I've been operating in is that, like, people have been telling me that I'm wrong and broken and, you know, fundamentally unworthy since before I was old enough to talk and form long-term memories. You know, so, and I've had to develop my own sense of how it is that I see myself as a person and how it is that I know that those things are not true, because that's never going to go away. Like, that's the world I live in, and I can carve out sacred ground in which there's mutual respect. But like, the reality of people telling me that I'm bad and wrong and broken and worthless, that's just not something I expect to ever go away entirely, which means that facing that online is different than facing that in person in some ways. There's ways in which it's not, and in which I just have to have the ability to say what needs to be said anyway, build community anyway. And I think that it is very possible and necessary to create boundaries online. Like, in one sense, I have a block list on Twitter where I've blocked probably over 10,000 accounts, some of which in a somewhat automated way, because if you want to talk to people who are acting in good faith, you've got to create a space that trolls can't get into and derail. And, you know, if you want to have a space where you can have a conversation between Jews, you got to keep out the Nazis, you know. And so that's one kind of very enforced boundary in the platform I'm creating. But there's also boundaries in the sense that I'm comfortable asserting authority in the conversations I'm leading online and in the interactions I have with people. You know, for instance, like, my Twitter discussion space is not an interfaith space. It's a Jewish conversational space, because that's something that's necessary for minority cultures sometimes. And it's fine that people want to watch, but it's like a restricted space in terms of participation. And like, enforcing that has taken some doing, but it's not impossible. It's possible to create spaces, and it's possible to like be very clear outside of that. Most of the conversations I have online like are broader and more interfaith. But it's very possible to have my own boundaries about what kind of conversations I am and am not willing to have, and on what terms, and who I am and am not willing to have in spaces I'm curating, and on what terms. And I think that boundaries never create themselves. They always, like, you have to be intentional about them, but it's kind of turned up to 11 online, especially since there's a lot of kind of new ways that you can get pressured not to have them.
I'm glad you mentioned pressure not to have boundaries. A lot of the chatter about social media is bubbles. You know, oh, there are people in bubbles, they're not. And to the extent that you're in an algorithm that is feeding you things that will take you down a rabbit hole that isn't maybe a truth rabbit hole, that's one thing. But it seems to me to be problematic because in our lives we have bubbles, like we don't admit people hopefully into our personal lives who are unkind to us, or
Right.
You know, you're not asked to engage with Nazis in real life in a room with them, and so and short of Nazis, you know, we are supposed to be allowed to say, I don't consent to be around people who don't treat me well. But it feels like we're being asked not to have that standard online, that's a bubble and that's bad. But you don't seem to be practicing that. You seem to be practicing self-care in that way.
I mean, it's not just self-care, it's also like social responsibility. Like, I see it as, you know, we wear masks to protect others. We get vaccinated to protect others because there needs to be a baseline level of vaccination in order for people to avoid outbreaks of these diseases. And if I'm going to be on social media, I feel like I have a moral responsibility not to be a vector for hatred and harassment. And I think that, you know, one thing is that I realized pretty quickly that if I wanted to be able to talk to, like, you know, people online with sort of like a small number of followers who are like just there to learn and have conversations, if I wanted to talk to them without exposing them to like massive traumatic harassment, I needed to block a bunch of people who were like obviously engaged in massive traumatic harassment, or who were likely to bring that to other people, or else I'd be responsible for the consequences of what I was bringing upon them. And I think that we're responsible for curating our spaces and taking responsibility, knowing what kinds of conversations we're trying to facilitate and why. And it's possible to make mistakes. You know, I'm sure I make mistakes about like who I welcome and who I don't, and like what I prioritize and what I don't. But I don't think the fact that mistakes are inevitable means that it would be better to just not have boundaries. Because if you don't have any boundaries, you end up in an echo chamber anyway, but you end up in an echo chamber dominated by some very hateful and destructive people who are like really trying to harm us. And so I think that cultivating an attitude of like seeking out good faith, figuring out what conversations you can have and in what contexts. And there's certain kinds of conversations I don't have online. Like, I don't talk to like, you know, people who are like down deep in the rabbit hole on Make America Great Again kinds of ideologies or those kinds of things. I do have those conversations in person. I do have those conversations when I'm doing like texting based one-on-one outreach. And the reason I don't have them online isn't because I don't think they're worthwhile. It's because there are trade-offs. If I have those kinds of conversations online, then it attracts a kind of attention and trolling that is harmful to other conversations that I think are really important. And I think that realizing that there are trade-offs, and it's not about devaluing anyone, it's about deciding what kind of space we're creating and what we need to do in order to facilitate conversations and community building. And I think that like boundaries are not hate, boundaries are social responsibility. That's how I see it.
That is incredibly powerful, and it really resonates with me as a teacher. One of the sort of parallel narratives to you know, this bubble narrative is around intellectual diversity on campus, and the idea being, you know, ideas are supposed to percolate on campuses, but there are limits to that. I actually have an obligation to help to make my courses a space not only where people aren't, you know, trolled and treated terribly, but where hopefully we meet the objectives that we had together in terms of what people are going to learn and the competencies they're going to build. And there's something, you know, we talk in First Amendment law about the heckler's veto, meaning, you know, sort of you shut down that which is, you know, unpopular. But I have this opposite to this thing. It's called the troll's syllabus, which is that you are so committed to having every voice or every idea come in that you actually allow a bad faith agenda setting. And so you have the troll's syllabus. And I think the idea of setting boundaries as social responsibility, it's a really powerful message for people involved in teaching, which I know you do as well, because it reminds us of our objectives. You know, what are we here with together? And I think it also broadens out the picture from not just the decision maker and the person that you're barring, but everybody else in the room.
Right.
Supposed to get.
There's also like, I think, a silencing effect that happens, like when you make white men feel like their perspectives are not being valued, everyone notices that, right? Like, and that gets treated as like incivility, as problematic as shutting down free speech. When you create an environment in which like disabled people or women or people of color or people who are like multiple things like that, that silencing is the default, and it can be very invisible. And if you aren't willing to be told that you're like not creating enough space for like white men, white non-disabled Christian men to like have all of their opinions taken as more important than they really are. Like if you're not willing to face criticism with that, like there's probably silencing that's happening. And I think the point you made about educational objectives is also a really important one. Like we have a responsibility to think about the way we're leading discussions and whether it's conducive to teaching the things we're trying to teach, and what we're teaching people about like what the truth is and what's legitimate within it. And that means that sometimes there's boundaries. And I think there's also like a consent issue, because like if we're telling students that a class has certain kinds of objectives and we're teaching certain kinds of things, and then what we allow in practice is for trolls to completely derail everything, like that's not what our students signed up for. Yeah. You know, they've signed up to learn from us, not from bad faith trolls. And like I think that we have a responsibility to like keep the promises we're making when we say this is what we're teaching and this is the values we're coming from.
And I think that's possibly the most powerful conclusion to this summer series on communication and community I can imagine. When we founded this project, the basic premise was to have a space where we would understand, I'm a lawyer actually, my apologies, that speech rights exist, but the really interesting conversations and the really hard work, particularly in a university, were around speech responsibilities, particularly as members of a community. And I feel like the threads that you've brought out and that Reverend Adams brought out had that quality of what are our responsibilities in these spaces and understanding who's in them. And I think for me, the takeaway is a powerful one, particularly about being able to say what you don't know, but also how we react to being told then what we've not gotten right. And seeing that, I think is among our community responsibilities, feels like a way to give ourselves the power to make the best decisions we can about those boundaries. So that's something I'm just sort of grateful for that came in today. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for being patient about accessibility. It's incredibly important, and a conversation worth having is a conversation worth pausing. So thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you, participants. And we will be sharing our fully captioned video before too long on the website. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.